At 25, most women are planning their futures or building careers. Sarah Jenkins was staring at a $2 million banknote, a fleet of rusting combines, and a freshly dug grave. The whole county placed bets on how fast she'd lose the farm. They were about to lose their money. The wind sweeping across Ogle County, Illinois, in early April carries a distinct chill, a biting, relentless cold that sinks into your bones and smells like damp soil and diesel exhaust. For Sarah Jenkins, that wind felt like a physical weight. It was the morning of Cody's funeral, and the sprawling 1,700 acres of Jenkins Farms stretched out beyond her kitchen window, a silent, mocking ocean of unplanted dirt. Cody had been 27. A freak structural failure on a 40-year-old grain bin ladder had taken him in seconds, leaving Sarah a widow before they had even celebrated their 3rd anniversary. They were supposed to conquer this land together. Cody was the 4th-generation farmer, the one with the soil in his blood. Sarah was the high school English teacher from 3 towns over, the outsider who had traded her lesson plans for bookkeeping, parts running, and the chaotic, beautiful life of a farm wife. Now, she was just the outsider again. The house was packed with people holding casseroles and offering hollow, hushed condolences. But beneath the polite Midwestern sympathy, the vultures were already circling. Sarah could see it in the way the neighboring farmers looked at her. Their eyes doing the brutal arithmetic of 1,700 acres of prime corn and soybean land suddenly left without an operator just 3 weeks before spring planting. The most dangerous vulture of all was sitting in her own living room. Richard Jenkins, Cody's father. Richard had retired 5 years ago, moving to Arizona and selling the farming operation and its mountain of debt to Cody. Richard was a hard, pragmatic man who had never believed Sarah was tough enough for the life. Before the funeral guests had even cleared the driveway, Richard pulled her into the cramped farm office. "I know you're grieving, Sarah," Richard said, his voice lacking any real warmth. He didn't look at her. He looked at the whiteboard where Cody had meticulously mapped out the spring crop rotation. "But the bank doesn't care about our grief. You have a $2 million operating loan coming due and the equipment notes are underwater. You can't run this place." Sarah sat in Cody's worn leather chair, clutching a half-empty mug of cold coffee. "Cody and I had a plan, Richard. The inputs are already paid for. The seed is in the shed. You have a fleet of aging equipment and no crew," Richard fired back, slapping a thick manila folder onto the desk. "I spoke to Mitchell Dawson this morning. Prairie States Ag is willing to buy the land. They'll absorb the debt, pay off the machinery, and cut you a check for $200,000. You can move back to town. Start over." Mitchell Dawson. The name made Sarah's stomach turn. Mitchell ran a massive corporate farming syndicate that had been swallowing up family farms across the Tri-County area for a decade. He had spent the last 3 years trying to bleed Cody dry, outbidding him on land leases and trying to poach their farmhands. "You talked to Mitchell Dawson before you even buried your son?" Sarah's voice trembled, not from sadness, but from a sudden, white-hot rage. "I am trying to save you from bankruptcy," Richard snapped. "You have until May 15th to get that crop in the ground. If you don't, you default on the bank covenants, and they will auction this place off for pennies. Don't be a fool, Sarah. Sign the intent to sell." Sarah looked down at the folder. She thought about the countless nights Cody had come home covered in grease and dust, his eyes alight with the dream of paying off the land and passing it down to kids they hadn't even had the chance to bring into the world yet. She looked at Cody's heavy canvas Carhartt jacket still hanging on the back of the door. Slowly, she pushed the folder back across the desk. "I'm not signing anything, Richard," she said, her voice dropping to a quiet, steel-edged whisper. "This is my farm now. I'm putting the crop in." Richard scoffed, a cruel, dismissive sound. "You don't know the first thing about calibrating a planter, let alone keeping a 20-year-old tractor running for 14 hours a day. You'll be begging me to call Mitchell by the end of the week." He turned and walked out, the screen door slamming behind him like a gunshot. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah was 25 years old, entirely alone, and staring down a deadline that would break seasoned veterans. She walked out to the massive steel machine shed. Inside sat the lifeblood of the operation, a heavily financed John Deere 8320R tractor and a monstrous, complex 2-4-row planter. She walked up to the massive green tractor, pressing her forehead against the cold steel of the tire. For the first time since the accident, she let herself cry. She cried for the future she had lost, for the terrifying mountain of steel and dirt in front of her, and for the sheer absurdity of what she was about to attempt. But when the tears finally stopped, a terrifying, unbreakable resolve settled in her chest. They thought she was just a grieving girl who would take the buyout and run. They were wrong. The first week of May arrived with a brutal, ticking clock. In farming, timing is everything. Plant too early, and the frost kills the seed. Plant too late, and the yield plummets, cutting into profit margins that were already razor thin. With 1,700 acres to cover, Sarah needed to be running the planter from dawn until midnight, every single day, just to beat the bank's May 15th deadline. She quickly realized that grief was a luxury she couldn't afford. She traded her funeral dress for heavy denim and Cody's old boots, diving headfirst into the chaotic, grease-stained reality of the operation. Her only lifeline was Dale Higgins. Dale was a grizzled, 50-something farmhand who had worked for Richard and then for Cody. He knew the land, he knew the machinery, and he was the only one who didn't quit when Sarah announced she was taking over. At first, Sarah viewed him as a godsend. She handled the seed tenders, the chemical mixing, and the bookkeeping, while Dale ran the massive John Deere tractor, putting the corn into the soil. But by day 4, things started falling apart. It began with small things. The GPS auto-steer system on the tractor mysteriously lost its calibration, costing them half a day of planting as Sarah scrambled on the phone with the dealership to troubleshoot it. Then the hydraulic lines on the planter kept losing pressure, leaving entire rows of soil barren. "Just old equipment, Sarah," Dale said, spitting a stream of tobacco onto the dirt as he wiped grease from his hands. "Told Cody before he passed we needed to upgrade these lines. It's gonna take me a few days to get the parts from Rockford." "A few days?" Sarah panicked, looking at the dark storm clouds gathering on the western horizon. The local meteorologist was predicting a massive 3-day rain system moving in by the weekend. If the fields got muddy, they wouldn't be able to run the tractors for a week. "Dale, we have 600 acres left. If we don't get them in before the rain, we miss the deadline." "Can't plant without hydraulic pressure, boss," Dale shrugged, his tone utterly devoid of urgency. "I'll head to town, see if they can rush the parts." Sarah watched his truck kick up dust down the driveway, a gnawing pit of anxiety twisting in her stomach. Something didn't feel right. Cody had spent all of February replacing the hydraulic seals on the planter. She knew this because she had held the flashlight for him while he cursed at the frozen metal. They weren't old lines. They were brand new. Driven by a desperate, frantic suspicion, Sarah walked back out to the planter. She crawled underneath the massive green steel frame, ignoring the dirt grinding into her clothes. She traced the main hydraulic hose from the tractor coupling back to the manifold, her breath caught in her throat. Deep in the tangle of hoses, hidden behind a steel bracket, the main pressure line wasn't blown. It had been deliberately loosened. The threaded coupling was backed off just enough to let fluid slowly leak out, dropping the pressure until the machine's safety sensors shut the system down. It wasn't a mechanical failure. It was sabotage. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Why would Dale sabotage the planter? She slid out from under the machine, her hands coated in slippery hydraulic fluid, and ran to the farm shop. Dale had left his work jacket draped over a chair. Feeling a deep pang of guilt but driven by survival, Sarah reached into the pockets. She pulled out a crumpled, greasy receipt from a diner in the next town over. It was dated yesterday, when Dale claimed he was at the parts store. Written on the back of the receipt, in sharp, aggressive handwriting, were 3 words and a number: Dawson, $15,000 bonus. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Mitchell Dawson, the corporate buyer. He wasn't just waiting for her to fail, he was actively paying her only employee to make sure she did. Dawson knew that if Sarah missed the planting window, the bank would seize the property, and he could buy it at auction for a fraction of what he offered Richard. And Richard, did Richard know? The betrayal made her dizzy. 30 minutes later, Dale's truck rolled back into the gravel drive. He stepped out, carrying a small cardboard box, a feigned look of exhaustion on his face. "Good news and bad news, Sarah," Dale called out, walking toward the shed. "Got the fittings, but the pump itself is shot. I'm gonna have to pull it. We're down for at least 48 hours. Sarah stepped out of the shadows of the machine shed. She held a heavy steel crescent wrench in her right hand, her knuckles white. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. The scared, grieving widow had died underneath that planter, replaced by a woman pushed to the absolute edge. "Tighten the coupling, Dale," Sarah said, her voice eerily calm, cutting through the wind. Dale froze. "What?" The primary hydraulic coupling, you backed it off a quarter inch with a wrench. Tighten it back up. Dale's eyes darted nervously. Look, Sarah, you don't know what you're looking at under there. The pressure. I saw the receipt, Dale. Sarah's voice cracked like a whip, echoing off the corrugated steel walls. I know about Dawson. I know about the 15 grand. Dale's faux sympathetic expression evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard sneer. He dropped the cardboard box in the dirt. He didn't even try to deny it. You're in over your head, little girl, Dale sneered, taking a step toward her. You think you can run this place? You're a schoolteacher playing in the dirt. Cody was barely keeping the bank off his back, and he actually knew what he was doing. Dawson is offering you a way out. Take the money and go back to town before you lose the shirt off your back. Get off my property, Sarah said, raising the wrench just an inch. Her eyes locked dead on his. If you are not off this farm in 2 minutes, I am calling the county sheriff and having you arrested for trespassing and vandalism. Dale stared at her for a long moment, realizing she wasn't bluffing. He spat on the ground near her boots, turned, and climbed back into his truck. You're done, Sarah. It's gonna rain for 3 days, and you can't run that rig by yourself. Dawson will own this place by June. As Dale's truck disappeared down the road, the first heavy drop of rain hit the brim of Sarah's cap. She was entirely alone. She had 600 acres left to plant, a sabotaged machine, a storm moving in, and a bank waiting to drop the hammer. She walked over to the box Dale had dropped, kicked it out of the way, and crawled back under the massive machinery. She had to figure out how to bleed a hydraulic line, and she had to do it right now. The rain was no longer a threat. It was a promise written in the bruised purple clouds rolling over the Illinois plains. Sarah lay on her back in the dirt, rain mixing with the grease on her face, wrestling with a 1-inch wrench. Her muscles screamed in protest, but the memory of Dale Higgins' smug, traitorous face fueled a fire in her veins that pushed the exhaustion away. She tightened the hydraulic coupling, wiped the slick fluid from the fitting with a shop rag, and prayed. Climbing into the cab of the John Deere 8320R, she turned the key. The massive diesel engine roared to life, shaking the glass. She engaged the hydraulic remotes. She held her breath, watching the pressure gauge on the Green Star monitor. The needle climbed, stabilized, and held firm in the green zone. She had done it. But triumph was short-lived. She looked at the clock on the dash. 4:15 p.m. She had roughly 36 hours before the torrential rains hit, and 600 acres of dirt still needed seed. At 14 acres an hour, the math was brutal. It was impossible for one person. Watch me, Sarah whispered to the empty cab. She dropped the planter into the dirt, engaged the auto steer, and pushed the throttle forward. For the next 12 hours, Sarah lived in a state of suspended animation. The world outside the tractor cab shrank to a narrow tunnel, illuminated by the piercing glare of the LED light bars cutting through the descending night. She drank lukewarm coffee until her stomach burned, playing the radio at a deafening volume just to keep her eyes open. By 2 a.m., the edges of her vision began to blur. The relentless drone of the tractor engine was playing tricks on her mind, making her hear Cody's voice in the static of the CB radio. She was losing her grip. She had covered 150 acres, but her body was failing her. She rested her head against the cool glass of the window, tears of pure physical exhaustion welling in her eyes. Dale was right. Richard was right. She couldn't beat the clock. Suddenly, a flash of light in the rearview mirror snapped her awake. 2 massive beams of halogen light were cutting across the dark field behind her, moving fast. Panic spiked in her chest. Had Dale come back to finish the job? Had Dawson sent someone to wreck the tractor? Sarah slammed the tractor into park, grabbed a heavy steel flashlight from the console, and stepped out onto the cab steps. The wind whipped her hair across her face as she watched a massive red Case IH Steiger tractor rumble to a halt at the edge of the field, towing a 36-row planter that dwarfed her own equipment. The cab door popped open, and a heavy-set figure climbed down, trudging through the loose soil toward her. As he stepped into the glare of her headlights, Sarah lowered the flashlight in shock. It was Wayne Miller. Wayne was a 60-year-old titan of Ogle County farming, a man notorious for his gruff demeanor and fierce independence. He farmed 3,000 acres on the northern border of her property and had famously thrown a punch at Mitchell Dawson at a county zoning meeting 2 years prior. "You're running crooked on your headlands, Jenkins," Wayne hollered over the roar of the idling engines, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his denim jacket. "Wayne?" Sarah called back, bewildered. "What are you doing here?" Wayne spat a sunflower seed shell into the dirt and looked out over the massive, unplanted field. Got a call from the diner in town. Heard Dale Higgins was running his mouth over a plate of eggs, bragging about how Dawson paid him to leave you high and dry. Bragging about how you were going to lose the farm by Friday. Wayne looked back at her, his eyes hard and uncompromising under the brim of his faded seed cap. Cody pulled my combine out of a sinkhole 4 years ago in the pouring rain. Refused to take a dime for it. And I'll be damned if I let a corporate suit like Dawson steal a family farm in my county because of a dirty trick. Wayne turned and pointed toward the road. Coming down the gravel highway were 2 more sets of headlights, pickups towing seed tenders. That's my son, Greg, and my foreman, Tom, Wayne said, a fierce grin breaking through his silver beard. We finished our acres yesterday. We brought our seed, our fuel, and our rig. We're going to run tandem, Sarah. We'll bill you for the fuel later. Right now, we've got a crop to put in the ground before the sky falls. Sarah couldn't speak. The overwhelming weight of her isolation shattered right there in the dirt. She choked back a sob, nodding fiercely. Don't cry on my time, kid, Wayne barked, though his eyes were kind. Get back in that cab. We're burning daylight, even if it is pitch black. For the next 24 hours, the Jenkins farm became a theater of war. The green John Deere and the red Case IH moved like synchronized dancers across the massive fields. A symphony of diesel and determination. Greg and Tom ran the tenders, hot refueling the tractors on the go, and loading seed with military precision. They didn't stop to eat. They ate sandwiches with one hand on the steering wheel. They didn't stop to sleep. Sarah felt like she was floating outside her own body, fueled entirely by adrenaline and the sheer defiant will to survive. At 3 p.m. on Thursday, with the sky turning an ominous bruised black and the wind howling across the flatlands, Sarah lifted her planter out of the soil at the very end of the final row. 10 minutes later, the skies opened up, unleashing a torrential downpour that turned the dusty fields into a sea of impassable mud. But it didn't matter. The seed was in the ground. The deadline was met. Sitting in the cab, listening to the rain hammer against the glass, Sarah Jenkins finally let out a breath she felt she had been holding since the day Cody died. Summer in Illinois is a brutal crucible of heat and humidity, but for Sarah, it was a season of quiet, relentless growth. The seeds she had fought so desperately to plant erupted into a sea of emerald green. She fired Dale officially, hired Wayne's nephew to help with the spraying, and spent her nights hunched over Cody's old ledgers, learning the agonizing mathematics of grain marketing. Thomas Bradley, the loan officer at First Heritage Bank, had driven out in late June to inspect the crop. He had expected to foreclose. Instead, he found fields standing taller and thicker than anyone else's in the county, meticulously cared for by a widow who refused to fail. The bank covenant was satisfied, but the true test still loomed: the harvest. To pay off the crushing $2 million operating note and secure the farm's future, Sarah needed a flawless harvest and strong grain prices. She had forward contracted a massive portion of her soybeans at a premium price, but the contract had a strict delivery clause. If she didn't deliver the grain to the river terminal by October 20th, the contract would default. She would be forced to sell at the current dismal cash price, and she would fall short on the bank loan. October arrived with a crisp golden chill. The soybeans were dry, the pods rattling like snakes in the wind. Sarah was at the helm of her John Deere S680 combine, devouring the fields row by row, watching the golden grain pour into the hopper. It was October 15th. She was days ahead of schedule. Victory was in her grasp. Then, disaster struck. Deep in the belly of the combine, a horrific, metallic grinding noise echoed over the fields, followed by a violent shudder that shook the entire cab. A cloud of black smoke billowed from the rear of the machine. Sarah slammed the emergency stop, her heart plummeting. She climbed out, popping the massive side panels. The main rotor drive belt had snapped, but it hadn't just broken, it had violently shredded, wrapping around the pulley system and bending the heavy steel tensioner bracket completely out of shape. The combine was dead in the water. Without the combine, she couldn't harvest. Without the harvest, she would miss the contract deadline in 5 days. Dawson's shadow fell over her once again. She immediately called the local implement dealer to order the parts. "Sarah, I'm sorry," the parts manager sighed over the phone. "That bracket is on a national back order. And, well, between you and me, Mitchell Dawson's syndicate bought out our parent company last month. Any priority shipping for non-syndicate farms has been suspended. I can't get you that part for 3 weeks. 3 weeks. She had 5 days. Dawson hadn't given up. He had just changed his tactics, using his massive corporate leverage to choke her out of the supply chain. Panic threatened to consume her, but the terrified girl who had cried against the tractor tire in April was gone. Sarah hung up the phone and walked into the farm shop. She stared at the wall of tools, her mind racing. She couldn't buy the part, so she would have to build it. She dragged the mangled steel bracket out of the combine and clamped it into the heavy vise on the workbench. She pulled down Cody's old welding helmet, fired up the oxyacetylene torch, and went to work. For 2 days, Sarah became a blacksmith. She heated the bent steel until it glowed cherry red, pounding it back into shape with a heavy sledgehammer. She welded reinforcing plates onto the weak spots, grinding the slag smooth. Her hands blistered and burned from the intense heat. It wasn't pretty. It was a scarred, blackened chunk of Frankenstein metal. But when she bolted it back onto the combine and threaded a new universal drive belt through the pulleys, it held fast. On October 18th, with 2 days to spare, the combine roared back to life. Sarah harvested the last acre on the morning of October 19th. The yield monitors in the cab flashed numbers that made her jaw drop. The agonizing attention to detail she had put into the soil had paid off. It was the highest-yielding crop Jenkins Farms had produced in a decade. The fleet of semi-trucks rolled out of her driveway, hauling the golden mountain of soybeans down to the river terminal. She had met the contract. She had secured the premium. She had won. The first week of November brought the first frost of the year, painting the harvested fields a glittering, icy white. Sarah walked into the Ogle County diner, the bell above the door jingling sharply. The morning breakfast rush was in full swing, the air thick with the smell of bacon and black coffee. Sitting in the corner booth were Richard Jenkins and Mitchell Dawson. They were laughing, a pair of men entirely confident in their ownership of the local world. Sarah walked straight to their table. The diner grew noticeably quiet as the locals recognized the widow who had done the impossible. Richard looked up, his smile vanishing. "Sarah, we're having a business meeting." "I know," Sarah said, her voice steady and echoing clearly across the diner. "I just wanted to drop this off before I headed to the bank." She pulled a single piece of paper from her jacket pocket and dropped it onto Dawson's plate of eggs. It was a copy of a deposit slip. The number at the bottom was staggering. Dawson picked it up, his face draining of color as he read the figure. "I just paid off the $2 million operating note, Richard," Sarah said, looking her father-in-law dead in the eye. "I also paid off the equipment loans." The land is completely unencumbered. And as of this morning, First Heritage Bank has approved my solo line of credit for next spring. Richard stared at her, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The meek, grieving girl he had tried to bully in April was standing before him as a formidable, hardened operator. She turned her gaze to Dawson. "You can stop paying off my hands, Mitchell, and you can stop buying up the parts supply lines. Because this farm is not for sale. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not ever. If you ever step foot on my property or interfere with my business again, I will ruin you in civil court. Do we understand each other?" Dawson swallowed hard, tossing the slip back onto the table, unable to meet her furious, unyielding gaze. Sarah didn't wait for an answer. She turned on her heel and walked out of the diner, the bell jingling behind her. As she stepped out into the crisp, freezing November air, she looked out toward the horizon, where the boundaries of her land began. The tractors were parked, the bins were full, the debt was gone. She pulled Cody's heavy canvas Carhartt jacket tighter around her shoulders, a deep, unbreakable smile spreading across her face. She was finally home. What an incredible testament to grit and refusing to back down when the world counts you out. Sarah's fight for her land proves that true strength isn't about what you start with, but what you're willing to endure. If Sarah's story inspired you, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs a reminder to keep fighting, and subscribe for more real-life stories of triumph against all odds.